Growing up, I had a lot of ear infections. Now, they were never too severe, but they weren't mild either. Few even required trips to the emergency room. But most, they just needed a cocktail of medications. Don't ask me why these infections kept happening. I'm sure there was some convoluted medical explanation. I'm certainly not smart enough to explain it. I'm just thankful that most of these infections occurred when I was too young to remember the worst of them. But, however bad they were, these infections did eventually subside. By the time I was in middle school, they'd ceased entirely. I was certainly relieved to be done with them, and so was my family. But all those infections and all the medications I took to treat them, they did have a lingering side effect. My hearing became extra sensitive. What some might consider moderately loud felt like a jet engine blowing directly into my ears. It wasn't always painful, but it was disorienting. So, as a result, I couldn't go to loud concerts, I couldn't handle noisy clubs, and if I went to a movie with lots of explosions and gunfire, I had to wear earplugs. Yeah, it was inconvenient and a little embarrassing, but for the most part, I managed as best I could. It even came with a few perks. I could hear things that others couldn't pick up on. Whether it was two people whispering under their breaths, my mom's cat hiding in her rose garden, or even a car making a noise it shouldn't be making, I would often hear it before anyone else. That made me a bit of a novelty among friends and relatives. It became a running joke that doing anything quietly around me was a waste of time. But aside from eavesdropping on a few embarrassing moments here and there, I was happy to shrug it off. And if that was the only drawback of having such sensitive hearing, I could live with it. But there ended up being a far higher cost, and I'm honestly not sure how to feel about it. It happened over the Thanksgiving holiday during my senior year of high school. That was also the first year when my family decided to spend Thanksgiving at my uncle's turkey farm upstate. Now, this was a significant change, because for much of my life, my uncle had not been a big part of our family. Now, the reasons for this are not entirely clear. I only know from other relatives that he and my mother had a falling out many years ago. And it was only after my grandfather died that they started to patch things up. On top of these personal clashes, maybe even because of them, my uncle was known for being quite eccentric. His life story would actually make for a hell of a movie, and that's only from the parts my mother was willing to share. Apparently, he ran away from home when he was 15 years old, got arrested multiple times, and even spent time in jail. He then went on to enlist in the military and even served overseas for a while. But the details for that part of his life are unclear. All I can tell you is, my uncle came back a very different man. He'd become a field medic during his service. He must have been pretty good at that too, because he ended up going to a prestigious medical school courtesy of a military scholarship. And after he graduated, he became a licensed doctor. He went on to work a number of jobs throughout the country, and this is also where he sort of disappears for a while. Nobody in my family really knows what he did during this part of his career. But eventually, he returns home as this highly respected pathologist. He even lands himself a prestigious position at one of the biggest hospitals in the region. It was the kind of place that the rich and well-connected went out of their way to go when they fell ill. And some of the people my uncle worked with, trust me, you would recognize their names. And when he wasn't busy being a doctor, he was managing this big turkey farm. And I know, that sounds like an odd side hustle for a doctor. Don't ask me when or how he set this operation up. He made so much money in his position that he probably could have done any number of things. But the details behind that aren't important. What matters is why he bought this particular turkey farm. That's where my story intersects with his. Because the first Thanksgiving we spent at this farm, that was the first time my mother allowed my uncle to be part of our lives. It was her way of making sure that the man he was now was not the same man she'd fought with in her youth. Personally, I didn't care much about that kind of family drama. I wasn't even that excited to spend Thanksgiving on a turkey farm of all places. Driving 2 hours to some rural plot of land upstate, can't say that held much appeal. Many of my siblings and cousins felt the same way. But once we got there, once we saw our uncle's elaborate farming operation, a lot of attitudes shifted, including my own. Because this was no dirty, backwater land in the boonies. This looked more like a country club than a turkey farm, complete with a pool, guest houses, and even a sauna. Just driving up this lengthy driveway, it felt like we were guests at a resort or something. My uncle was even there to welcome us as our car pulled up. He also looked more imposing than the photos my mother had shown me of him. But he was still very excited to see us. He knew all our names, he remembered every dessert, snack, and drink we liked. He even made sure to give us the Wi-Fi password before we entered the main house, which might as well have been a mansion. Whatever reservations we might have had before, they were long gone now. My dad, my siblings, my cousins, and the rest of my relatives, they were thrilled to spend Thanksgiving in a place like this. But while they fawned over the size of my uncle's estate, he and my mother stepped aside for a brief chat. No one else could hear them talking under their breath, but thanks to my overly sensitive hearing, I did pick up on a few things.
Don't worry, little sister. I promise. I am not the man you once knew. I've since become part of something far greater.
My mother still had a few tense words for him, but the exchange that followed, I prefer not to share that. Because in the end, they kept those lingering issues private. They agreed to make this Thanksgiving as memorable as possible. And in that, they certainly succeeded, albeit in ways only I could appreciate. During our first day at the turkey farm, my uncle gave us this grand tour. This place certainly had plenty to offer. Almost everyone else was interested in the pool and sauna. I found myself more taken by the actual farming operation. That occurred on this large, fenced-off plot of land to the west of the main house. The sheer number of turkeys in this area actually surprised me. I admit, I know nothing about the logistics of turkey farming, but my uncle claimed that his farm was one of the best operations in the country. People were willing to pay a hefty premium for one of his turkeys, and Thanksgiving was always an eventful time of year for him. What made them so special, he didn't say. All anyone could tell from a distance was that these turkeys were bigger than most. They were definitely the kind of birds you would serve a large family with a big appetite. But once you got a little closer, you noticed there was something strange about them. Well, maybe most people wouldn't notice, not unless you had some expertise in turkeys, farming, managing animals, or just happened to have extremely sensitive hearing. Because at one point, my uncle let me and my younger cousins through the fence. He even let us walk up to some of the birds. While my younger cousins were just excited to see these animals up close, I found myself taken by the expression of their undersized faces. And I know, turkeys aren't known for being expressive. But me being curious, I found myself approaching one particular turkey. I got so close that I could have reached out and touched it. That's when I heard it, this voice echoing from within.
Please, I beg you, don't do this to me.
I was more than a little shocked. At first, I thought I was just hearing things. But then I heard it again, and again, and again. It was like a mantra, but it didn't seem to be coming from the turkey's mouth. It came from inside, as though someone had put a speaker in its belly. I tried to get in a little closer, but then my uncle showed up and led us back to the house. He seemed quite intent on leaving the turkeys alone. I was tempted to ask more questions, but I was just too freaked out. I hoped it was nothing, just my mind and my ears playing tricks on me. But later that night, I woke up to use the bathroom. It was around 3:30 a.m. I was half asleep. But even before I made it to the bathroom, I could hear these faint voices from outside. The fact that the window in my room overlooked the turkey pens was not lost on me. I really didn't want to believe that I'd heard anything. But even after I finished using the bathroom, even after I splashed water on my face, I still heard it.
Please, no more. Stop this. I'm sorry. Do anything. Free me. I beg you.
I ended up putting in earplugs for the rest of the night. That helped stifle the noise. I still didn't get much sleep. I just couldn't stop wondering. What was I hearing? Why was I hearing it? Was it real? Was I going insane? I dreaded the answers to every one of those questions. I was tempted to talk to my uncle, but I decided to keep this to myself. The last thing I wanted was to cause a scene, especially with my mom and uncle finally making amends. But the next day, Thanksgiving Day, that ended up complicating my efforts even more. It started off so promising. It began raining that morning and continued well into the evening. While it disappointed everyone who wanted to go into the pool, I was relieved. The sounds of the rain helped drown out those voices I'd been hearing. They also helped me relax as best I could. So I spent much of the day playing video games with my relatives, watching football, and enjoying the various amenities of my uncle's estate. All the while, my parents and uncle cooked Thanksgiving dinner. And they really went all out. My uncle even claimed he reserved one of his special turkeys just for this occasion. I only got a brief glimpse of it before my dad put it in the oven, and it was the biggest turkey I'd ever seen. But after what I'd heard the other day, I still wasn't sure I wanted to eat it. But after it came out of the oven, once dinner was served in this big elaborate spread, I admit my appetite overshadowed my reservations. As we all sat down at the dinner table, it felt like a scene right out of a classic Thanksgiving spread. Fancy white tablecloth, fine china, and polished utensils perfectly arranged. Every classic holiday food you can imagine was present. My mom and uncle were practically beaming. I guess whatever baggage they still had, they'd successfully buried it in the past. Then, my uncle led everyone in saying grace. And at the same time, the rain outside briefly settled, and a heavy silence fell over the dining room. That's when I heard it again. And this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the perfectly cooked turkey in the center of the table.
No, not this. Please.
I tensed up. I started shaking. I'm pretty sure my appetite disappeared at that moment. But near as I can tell, nobody else was hearing this. It was only me. I was convinced at that point that I really was going crazy. What else could explain me hearing voices that nobody else could? But then, after grace had ended, I saw my uncle get a carving knife. I saw him look at the turkey in this strangely excited way. Everyone else might have thought he was just grateful to do the honors. But when he cut into that turkey, when those cries within the cooked bird grew louder and louder, he practically seethed with delight. He also muttered something under his breath, something only I was able to hear.
Keep screaming. You know you deserve this.
That left me conflicted and more than a little queasy. On one hand, I was relieved because it implied that my uncle knew there was something going on with the turkey. Even if he couldn't hear it, he knew. That meant I wasn't crazy, but it also meant that what I heard was real. And as my uncle served up a heaping of tender turkey meat, my family dug in. The way they all chewed their food, the way they savored every bite. More than a few relatives commented how this might be the best meal they'd ever eaten. My uncle just raised his glass and thanked them.
I'm just so thankful that my family can finally share this with me.
He made that comment before taking a big bite of turkey for himself. I couldn't bring myself to eat any. I don't remember how I convinced my family to let me leave dinner early, but I managed to pretend to be sick for the rest of our visit. And, much to my relief, my parents bought it. They allowed me to remain in the guest room, cooped up in bed for the next day and a half. During that time, I kept my ears plugged. I listened to music. I kept white noise playing on my phone at night. And I didn't dare look out the window towards the turkeys. Real or not, I didn't want to think about what those voices were or why I was hearing them. When we finally left my uncle's farm, I was relieved. But, much to my chagrin, everyone else had such a great time. My mother and uncle ended up hugging, now on the best of terms, it seemed. My dad, my siblings, and my cousins, they all agreed. This should be our new Thanksgiving tradition. Come to my uncle's turkey farm, enjoy one of his famous turkeys, completely ignoring all the horrible things I'd been hearing. I managed to hold my tongue, still pretending to be sick. But my uncle loved the idea. He said we were always welcome to visit. He even mentioned he was planning on retiring from medicine soon, claiming he had other passions he'd like to pursue. Still remembering what I'd heard him say during Thanksgiving dinner, well, I did not have to fake being sick at that moment. For a time, I was eager to put the events of that Thanksgiving behind me. My preferred method of coping was to simply not think about it. I admit, it's not all that healthy, but what else could I do? In the months that followed, I buried myself with school, work, and whatever distractions I could find. I also began dabbling in some less than legal substances. I prefer not to say what they were, but if it slowed my mind down, if it helped mute all the crazy noises I kept hearing, I tried it. And if it worked, I did more of it. So, it probably won't shock anyone when I say that this became a problem. So much so that it nearly got me expelled from school. And at one point, my parents planned to have an intervention for me. I know because I overheard them talking about it one night when they thought I was asleep. That should have been the incentive I needed to get help. But nope. I decided to do something extra stupid. I gathered up all the drugs I'd hidden in my room and just took them all at once. And no, I didn't think it through. And no, I wasn't trying to off myself or anything like that. I honestly don't remember what was going through my head when I did it, but I do remember feeling dazed, sick, and agitated. I started sweating profusely. I couldn't stay still. So I then tried to sneak out of my room and out the back door. But that's when I blacked out. I later learned I collapsed on the floor in the hallway. My brother later said I kept yelling for everyone to be quiet. He even said I'd mentioned something about evil turkeys. It's probably for the best that he just chalked it up to some drug-induced ramblings. What happened after that gets really fuzzy, and I doubt my family has been entirely honest with me during that missing time. But eventually, I wake up in a hospital bed. I'm hooked up to a bunch of IVs. I also ended up having my stomach pumped. But standing right next to me was my uncle.
You're very lucky. The substances we found in your system, they would have killed a lesser man. But it seems you're much stronger than you think.
Not gonna lie, he was the last person I wanted to see. But I was in no state to do or say much. I just laid there in bed, saying as little as possible and letting my uncle be Mr. World-Class Doctor. I later learned that he'd driven all the way to my mother's house after learning of my overdose. It was actually his week off. He'd been planning to go on an exotic vacation. But he canceled it, saying he took his oath seriously, especially to family. At first, I resented him for such dedication. But this is also where I came to see my uncle in a new light. Because while he was treating me, he helped minimize the extent of my drug use. He also did plenty to placate the concerns of my parents and siblings. He assured them that he would take care of me. And he would do it free of charge. But I was still incredibly suspicious. And my uncle clearly knew that. he ended up knowing a lot more than I gave him credit for. Because while he wasn't treating me, he was making quite a few friends at the hospital. Him being so big in his field, he was like a rock star among the other doctors. And since he was there to help, he ended up doing a bunch of consults for other patients. And one in particular caught his attention. Apparently, this same hospital had recently admitted this man that the FBI was investigating. I'd give you his name, but I'd rather not have anyone look up his numerous crimes. The one that most interested law enforcement was this major extortion racket he'd helped run. I never learned all the details, but it involved a mix of illegal gambling and Ponzi schemes, the kind that had ruined the lives of entire families. Now, he wasn't the only one involved. In fact, several of his partners had already gone to prison. But somehow, this guy managed to stay free. He probably thought he was the lucky one. He probably thought he was smart, having beaten some pretty long odds. Then, he gets in this nasty car wreck. He injures himself badly and wrecks his shiny new Mercedes in the process. He also had a passenger in the car with him, a prostitute who was also badly injured. But I doubt this man cared much about her. Initially, it didn't seem like this guy's injuries were severe, let alone fatal. But then, my uncle insisted on running a few extra tests. I don't exactly know what those tests revealed, but the man was not discharged, and his condition soon took a turn for the worse. Then, on the night before I was set to be released, this man's bed was wheeled into my room. He ended up being right next to me, separated only by a white curtain. And no, this was not by accident. As I'm trying to heal and get my strength back, I start hearing more things about this guy. He's not fully coherent, but he is aware enough to keep asking for his lawyer. I think he was aware there were some law enforcement types in the hospital interested in talking to him. "Get my lawyer over here. I don't care if his wife is giving birth. Make him answer the damn phone." He said a number of other things to a few nurses. Things that shattered whatever sympathy you might have had for him. I really didn't want to be near him for another night. But then, right around midnight when things got really quiet at this hospital, my uncle walks into the room. He doesn't look at me. He just heads over to the man in the bed. I can't see anything other than the faint outline of their bodies, but I can still hear. And what he says radically changed how I saw that fateful Thanksgiving trip to my uncle's turkey farm.
"I'm afraid I have some bad news for you. It seems there's an infection in your liver. It's drug resistant and very likely fatal. I'm sorry I have to give you this news, but I'm even more sorry at what I must do now, knowing your life will end before you face justice for your many, many crimes."
There was a fair amount of cursing and crying from that man. And despite what happened next, I still couldn't feel sorry for him. Because while this man was crying, my uncle takes out this special black case that he'd been carrying. He then retrieves this egg. By the way he held it over him, it was definitely more than a standard chicken egg.
"In less than an hour, your liver will fail. More organs will follow, and you will die. But instead of the sweet release of death, your soul will be transferred into this turkey egg. And when it hatches, you'll be trapped inside, fully aware and fully capable of experiencing its life. But even after it dies, you still won't be free. You'll still feel it as it's consumed with delight by loving, decent people. The same people you hurt so much with your crimes."
I don't entirely know the intricacies of what my uncle did next. Not sure if it was some ritual he picked up while serving overseas, or some real legitimate magic he learned from God knows where. It's probably best I not describe it, but the things I heard, the noises that man made, oof, it left quite an impression. I doubt I'll ever run a stop sign again after that. After my uncle was done, after the man fell silent, my uncle came over to me. He had since pocketed the egg, The way he looked at me, he clearly knew I had overheard. I think that was his way of getting his point across. I didn't need to say much to acknowledge it. I just nodded and he understood. But before he left the room, he took one more thing out of that black case he'd been holding. It was a plastic container with what looked like some sliced turkey over a bed of rice and broccoli. He then gave it to me atop a tray, along with a plastic fork.
Just some leftovers I brought from my farm. It's better than any hospital food you'll ever eat. And it might even get you excited for Thanksgiving later this year.
He then steps out of the room, leaving me alone with the dying criminal in the bed next to me and the turkey meal in the container. And yes, I did eat it this time. And yeah, I did hear things coming from it. Cries of agony, pleas for mercy. But knowing now where it came from, knowing who it belonged to, I didn't hesitate this time. And I freely admit, that turkey was delicious. And yeah, I admit, I'm very much looking forward to Thanksgiving at my uncle's turkey farm.